Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank our co-sponsors for joining with us today. UCLA Asia Pacific Center Program on Central Asia, the Burkle Center for International Relations, and Luskin Department of Public Policy. We're all grateful to all three of them. Now that the dust from the Taliban's victory has perhaps begun to settle, we can try to begin to search for clues on how Afghanistan's neighbors in the MENA region will be impacted. We're thrilled to bring a powerhouse panel to the stage for this discussion today, the so-called stage. First in our three-part mini-series in Afghanistan, which will be occurring the next 2 Thursdays at this time. Our first speaker is Jennifer Caffarella, who is the inaugural National Security Fellow at the Institute for the Study of War, ISW as they call it, a position created to sponsor rising national security leaders. Jennifer's work focuses on U.S. defense strategy, including how the U.S. must adapt to current and future threats. She's an established expert on Syria, the Middle East, and jihadism. Jennifer regularly briefs senior decision makers, as well as U.S. and allied military units. Wow, she previously served as ISW's research director from 2019 until 2020, when she was responsible for setting the organization's research priorities. She is a graduate of ISW, Hertog War Studies Program, and was the Institute's first Evans Hansen Fellow, which sponsors outstanding alumni of the War Studies Program. Ladies and gentlemen, Jennifer Caffarella.
Thank you so much for having me and for that warm introduction. Thanks also to the entire CMed team for convening us today for this discussion. I think it is, of course, important given the scope of what has occurred. But I think what's useful here is for us to consider the consequences, not just within Afghanistan, but indeed for U.S. national security priorities writ large, because the consequences certainly are not limited to Afghanistan. I'll offer a couple thoughts on 2 major themes that I am tracking in the aftermath that can hopefully set us up for some good questions. The first is the consequences of the Taliban's victory for the global Salafi jihadist movement. As many of you, I'm sure, already know, there has been a longstanding rift within that movement between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda on one end of the spectrum and ISIS on the other. The Taliban's ability to now recreate the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan is a major sea change moment for the global movement that actually has the potential to put the ball back in Al-Qaeda's court and to diminish the value of the ISIS brand. ISIS, of course, had claimed that it established an Islamic caliphate and was taking the mantle of leadership of the global jihadist community from the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The destruction of ISIS's physical caliphate in Iraq and Syria significantly eroded that ISIS claim by 2019. However, the real challenge that Al-Qaeda will now, or that ISIS rather, will now face is the ability of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban to argue, probably convincingly, that their methodology is more successful in the long term. One of the gravest threats I think the United States faces in the aftermath of the way that we withdrew from Afghanistan is the fact that it has proven to many within the jihadist movement that the United States can be outlasted and that a strategy of attrition will succeed. This has consequences for the strategies the United States is likely to encounter from jihadist groups in other theaters. ISIS in Iraq and Syria is already waging a war of attrition with the expectation that time is on its side, and with a particular focus on the next generation of Iraqi and Syrian children who will grow up with a fractured security and governance landscape. I think as we look for how the movement will respond moving forward, there are 2 big themes. The first is whether ISIS will attempt to reclaim a more flashy global presence. ISIS is, of course, on the upswing across Northern Africa in very dangerous ways, but we could see ISIS decide to prioritize renewed global attacks or other uses of mass violence in order to, put itself back in the spotlight and take away some of the glory that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban are now claiming in Afghanistan. But the second thing I think we should look for is how the broader movement of foreign fighters, of resource flows, of facilitators within the jihadist movement shifts. For example, will we see an outflow of foreign fighters from Syria into Afghanistan? Will we see renewed mobilization of foreign fighters either within the Central Asian region or potentially from other regions, including Africa or even Europe, either to join the Taliban or to join in the broader cause that Al-Qaeda leads to advance that jihad globally? I'll say a couple more things about what I think this means for U.S. strategy and U.S. war waging moving forward, and then I'll stop so we can get on to the next panelists and questions. I think there's a difference between the way the United States waged the war and the way the United States conducted the withdrawal. And I frame that because I think one of the most difficult and important conversations that Americans are collectively having right now is whether it was possible to succeed in Afghanistan and whether it was possible to withdraw responsibly after having failed. The United States clearly fell short of achieving our desired outcomes in Afghanistan. I would argue that we did nonetheless achieve a lot. I think Americans have benefited from 20 years of relative security against the kind of Al-Qaeda attack that we experienced on 9/11. I also think that US operations did some objective good in Afghanistan. However, our inability to accomplish desired outcomes raises major questions about our ability to formulate and execute strategy amidst the complexity of environments like Afghanistan, which involves the social landscape, the political complexity, but also the regional complexity. It is vital, in my view, that we learn from our inability to adapt in Afghanistan in order to succeed in theaters like the Middle East, where the United States has also struggled, actually, to deliver strategic outcomes given the complexity of the operating environment. In this case, in Iraq and Syria, I'll end here, but the United States did accomplish the defeat of ISIS's physical caliphate, as I mentioned, but has struggled to capitalize on that in order to produce durable stabilization outcomes that could deny ISIS the opportunity to resurge. And my concern is that we're seeing a pattern in Iraq and Syria that does actually resemble the US failures in Afghanistan to capitalize on the success of our initial overthrow of the Taliban in 2001, which led to a protracted conflict in which American will to remain engaged in the fight ultimately became sapped. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. You'll be back shortly. But meanwhile, let's go on to Kirsten Fontenrose, who was the director of the Scowcraft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council, which is a bipartisan think tank headquartered in Washington, D.C., as many of you know. She has 20 years of experience working with the national security apparatuses of nations in the Middle East and Africa from positions within the U.S. Department of Defense, Department of State, White House, private industry, and nonprofit sector. She most recently served as the Senior Director for Gulf Affairs at the U.S. National Security Council, leading the development of U.S. policy toward nations of the GCC and Yemen, Egypt, and Jordan. Kirsten holds a BA in Middle Eastern Studies from the College of William & Mary and MA in Middle Eastern Studies from Indiana University and an MBA from Harvard Business School. Ladies and gentlemen, Kirsten Fontenrose.
Thank you so much, Steve. And thanks to Jenny and Robin for joining on this. And I really enjoyed those comments. I know I jumped on 5 seconds late, so I may have missed some. I'm looking forward to Q&A. I will focus here on the calculations that it looks like to me the big 3 Gulf states in the Afghanistan sphere are weighing. So let's start with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. I think they're looking to Russia and China to provide better eyes and ears on the ground inside Afghanistan than the US can post-withdrawal. Saudi is exploring a closer relationship with India as well, and it's rethinking its relationship with Pakistan. So its foreign policy, just by this one withdrawal, has kind of all been put into question, not in terms of whether their existing policies were smart, but how to now either leverage or round up their interests based on this withdrawal. So you've noticed probably that they've offered to mediate talks between India and Pakistan. And this is really smart. It's a way for Saudi to put itself in the good graces of both countries without having to choose sides. This lets them weigh India's potential defense against what might arise out of Afghanistan with the eyes and ears on the ground that the ISI will have, and to exploit and benefit from both. Saudi is also watching how India's purchase of the Russian S-400 fares, because if it receives a national security waiver from the US and avoids sanctions, Saudi will seek the same. And the threat that perceived by Saudi and the UAE that would require something like a missile defense system in response is now made greater by the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. Since 2019, the Taliban have stood up several professional drone units. They've been inspired by tactics that the head of their first drone unit saw in ISIS propaganda videos that came out of Iraq and Syria. And these drone units were instrumental in the takeover, in both creating fear and in taking out some of their biggest political opponents and the biggest kind of influencers on the ground. And the lessons they learned and the supply chains they developed can be transferred to affiliate groups inside and outside of Afghanistan, whether it's Haqqani, Al-Qaeda, or smaller groups in Central Asia or India, or yet to emerge splinter groups we could see. And Saudi and the UAE must worry about this and about the prospect of a Taliban regime mimicking an Iranian policy and fostering its own proxies. The potential for the Taliban to partner with Iran, I think, is also of concern to these two countries. Iran has hosted al-Qaeda members for years and could encourage or assist al-Qaeda's use of Afghanistan as a headquarters from which to plot attacks against their Gulf neighbors or the West, as Jenny just talked about. And this would allow Iran the use of its favorite foreign affairs tool, which is plausible deniability. The idea that Iran would not partner with the Taliban because it is concerned about the plight of the Afghan Hazara, I think, is short-sighted. Tehran seeks out Shia minority groups and countries with Sunni leadership because these minorities are disenfranchised and can be mobilized to act against Iran's adversaries. But if it will be more effective to leverage the Taliban for this goal, Iran will do that instead of working or seeking out the Hazaras. Since Qatar is the only Gulf nation with real leverage over parts of the Taliban, Saudi and the UAE may need to talk to Qatar and press the case that it is a danger to all of their regimes if the Taliban allow al-Qaeda to reconstitute on their watch. The UAE does not enjoy the idea of engaging with Qatar on this, nor the idea of propping up a Taliban government when the Emirati special forces died fighting them, nor the idea of dumping millions into aid for Afghanistan to fix a rookie error by the US. But since Qatar has become the belle of the ball in Washington, the UAE sees the need to get on board. Qatar is encouraging engagement with the Taliban, and initially this was done smartly by focusing on the risks of not doing so. The foreign minister and the emir at Anga stressed that if the Taliban are not assisted in stabilizing the country, other groups with global jihad goals, some of which Jenny referenced, could exploit the situation. And an Afghanistan under their control would be much more dangerous to other nations than an Afghanistan controlled by the Taliban. This is a powerful argument because in other scenarios, like deciding what to do in Libya or Syria, for example, the conversation in the West and the Gulf and the Levant often centered around who would take power after a regime fell or was toppled. In recent weeks, Qatar has tried to make Western governments aware of the factional infighting occurring among Taliban and its friends. But this is a dangerous narrative. This is moving a bit away from the counterterrorism justification for engagement. And it looks more like apologies. And this is a little bit dangerous. I don't think it's what Qatar's intending to do, but they have to be careful about how this comes off. Without eyes on the ground to verify, other nations do not have visibility on the localized infighting and the retribution actions that are occurring inside Afghanistan. This is much like in post-Gaddafi Libya, where armed gangs loosely affiliated with some named group carried out roundups and murders of their opponents or personal or political enemies. In that period of lawlessness, when it was not clear who controlled law enforcement and the public had no recourses against this kind of action. Well, if that's happening in Afghanistan now, it does mean that groups other than the Taliban could be carrying out retributive violence. But countries like the US that have withdrawn their people will have no way to differentiate between the Taliban and other actors. And Qatar will have no way to prove that the Taliban is not to blame. Qatar should not put themselves in this position of having to be those that doing that kind of explanation or doing that kind of justification for the Taliban regime. Qatar runs the risk of being the Taliban's PR firm right now at a time when the Taliban do not have full control of their operatives around the country. And while the Taliban is nonetheless accountable for rogue actions of its members, Qatar should not set itself up to be that. But right now it is. Qatar should tell the Taliban that they will act as their mediators, but they will not be their advocates. If Qatar chooses this role for themselves, Western governments will only have their backs in this capacity until the Taliban are confirmed to have murdered or beaten one woman or closed one girls' school. And when American or other public opinion turns on the Taliban, and it is not on the Taliban's side as it is any of those publics, then the public opinion will also turn on Qatar. And I think that's a risk that they need to consider right now in their engagements with Western governments and with America and with other parts of the international community. I'll stop there so we can talk more in Q&A.
Okay, so now we come to a little different kind of program after we've heard these terrific openings. And for this, I am delighted to introduce Robin Wright, who is a famous senior fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Woodrow Wilson Center. She has reported from more than 140 countries for the New Yorker, the Washington Post, Time, the New York Times Magazine, and the Los Angeles Times, among many others. Robin has also been a fellow at the Brookings Institution, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Yale, Duke, Stanford, Dartmouth, and the University of California. She has received numerous awards for her work, including the UN Correspondents Association Gold Medal for International Affairs, the National Magazine Award for Iran Reportage, and the Overseas Press Club Award for her coverage of African wars. Robin Wright has authored 8 books. So, Robin, what's your perspective? How bad is this? I mean, after all, nobody cared in the United States, it seemed, about Afghanistan, but now everybody's talking about Afghanistan. We lose, we talk. That's not good. Where are we?
Where are we? So I would echo some of the things that Jennifer said. I think one of the thing to worry about the most is we're now in the 3rd generation of jihadism. And this is a problem that's not limited to Afghanistan. We've seen the globalization of both Al-Qaeda and ISIS, particularly over the past 5-6 years, but this is not over. One of the striking things about the testimony yesterday by the 3 top military brass responsible for ending America's longest war was, one of the references to the fact that we're now dealing with the grandsons of the original jihadis who fought the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And the estimate that Al-Qaeda will reconstitute in Afghanistan within 6 to 12 months with a capability or potential anyway of striking the American homeland. This was pretty chilling stuff. When Jennifer talked about the trend lines, I think there are 3 things that we need to know. With each generation, the group or faction has been able to mobilize the next generation in half the time. With each generation, the net has been cast ever wider. With the war against the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 1980s, the net was basically or largely from the Gulf states. With the emergence of the 2nd generation represented by Osama bin Laden and his attacks on the World Trade Center the first time in the 1990s, you saw the net ever wider with across the Middle East. And of course, with ISIS in 6-7 years ago, the net was global. It's kind of scary when you think about the range of people that all of these groups taking advantage of the insecurity or uncertainty or inability of the Taliban to control the entire Afghan countryside, what they might do. The other thing is that with each generation, the agenda has become ever more militant. And it was originally focused on getting the Soviets out of Afghanistan, and then it was against the United States out of the Middle East, and now it's attacking the United States at home to diminish its power and its reputation. And I think General Milley was very candid yesterday when he said the loss in Afghanistan will affect the credibility of the United States in the eyes of both its allies and its adversaries. One of the things that's really striking in talking about where does jihadism go next is looking at a place in Southern Africa, in Mozambique. I was there in 1975 when this country, a former Portuguese colony, became independent. It borders South Africa. This is a country that is 60% Christian. And yet the United States in August sanctioned ISIS in Mozambique. It has become a factor there as well. So the range and scope sometimes surprises us, and I think the tactics are likely to as well. With each generation, they have become bolder, more imaginative, and often 1, 2, 3, or 10 steps ahead of the United States. On what Kirsten said, I would challenge a little bit the assumption that Iran is going to be some kind of ally or conduit for Al-Qaeda. I think the Iranians have been very worried about the Taliban. During the 1990s, they looked at the Taliban as a backward movement. They didn't allow education of women. And of course, Iran, for all its many flaws, has allowed the education of women. They've had a woman vice president, many women in parliament. Women have won the Cannes Film Festival and a Nobel Peace Prize. Women are an integrated part of society in a way that they are not going to be allowed once again in Afghanistan. I think the Iranians are very worried even more about the rise of another Sunni movement, and that's ISIS Khorasan. So the Iran hosting the Al-Qaeda was in part to keep an eye on them, including Saif al, who is widely believed to be a possible successor to Ayman Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda since bin Laden was killed by the United States a decade ago. So when I look at the kind of consequences of Afghanistan for the broader region, I worry about the fact that indeed jihadism looks to have prevailed. When you look at a region in general, across the Middle East, North Africa, and parts of South Asia or Central Asia, you're talking about failed, or fragile regimes, autocracies, authoritarian monarchies, where people do not have, whether it's jobs or political inclusion or social equality, that makes all of these countries hotbeds for jihadism as the only alternative that will give them power or a means of opposing those in government. So I worry a great deal that the fourth generation, what emerges out of Afghanistan, will be deadlier and more of a threat, not necessarily in the sense of a 9/11 attack, but potentially in the kind of variety, whether it's attacks on nightclubs or street attacks or on university campuses, the kind of thing we've seen in Europe with the truck bomb in Nice, that there are all kinds of these actions, whether by lone wolves who are sympathizers or in plots that have been fomented by groups using Afghan soil. And I agree that there's a real danger that in the chaos of the US withdrawal and this transition period as Afghanistan struggles, or the Taliban struggles to create a government and create control, that we're likely to see the emergence of the kind of gangs we saw in Libya that will take advantage and could mushroom into whole new variations of jihadism. I'll stop there, and I look forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Okay, so let's get all three of our speakers in, and we'll begin to ask some questions. We really have all sorts of questions that are coming in, and the first one I'm going to use was the first one we got from Roz Mandelkorn of the United States. Is there any chance, and I ask all three of you that, but all three of you don't have to answer, any chance that ISIS, the Taliban, Al-Qaeda could unite either as a single unit or for a singular specific goal. Anybody want to take that on?
I'm happy to take that. I
Great,
don't
Robin.
think there's a hope in hell. I think there's a fundamental difference, and there always has been. ISIS, remember, emerged out of Al-Qaeda, and the kind of disillusionment it had with Al-Qaeda for not being more aggressive. There's a fundamental difference. Al-Qaeda always believed, bin Laden argued against creating a caliphate before they had convinced the local population or won over hearts and minds. And whereas ISIS said, we are going to create a caliphate and then convert people forcefully if need be, killing fellow Muslims if need be. And the idea that they would unite at the moment, I think, is illusory. Do they down the road unite at some point, or have common tactics and goals because they see, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They see a common enemy, a common threat to where they're based. But these are groups that now have their own leadership, hardened fighters, and we are likely to see, whether it's a mini civil war or a full-blown civil war, play out in Afghanistan and potentially elsewhere.
I would only add to,
Jennifer?
I would only add to that excellent overview from Robin that I think it's important to note that America is in some ways even more at risk as these organizations compete, because it drives this sort of reciprocal evolution and competition to be harder, better, faster, more ruthless, et cetera, that ultimately does continue to propel the movement and its expansion. So I think that's important to note, because sometimes folks can tend to assume that maybe they will erode each other's strength in that competition. And what we've actually seen is the opposite. We've seen each grow stronger and more global as they have competed. The second thing I'll offer, though, is that I do think it's important to consider under what conditions might we see a realignment within the movement. I agree that right now the competition between the ideological differences and the strategic differences precludes them from aligning. But I do think it's worth remembering that Al-Qaeda had desired to rejoin. It was ISIS that refused to come back into the fold or even to consider mediation. And ISIS has had internal disputes within its senior councils over how to treat the Sunni population, whether they went too far. And there are many reports that some of those internal disputes within ISIS actually led to internal purges and the executions of some high-ranking ISIS individuals. So I think it depends in part what kind of pressure ISIS is under. Right now, they aren't under actually as much pressure as they perhaps need to be to force that kind of evolution. Although I'll note that I'm not sure it's actually in our interest to put the kind of pressure on ISIS that would drive it to rejoin with Al-Qaeda, because that's certainly not the outcome we desire. We should be trying to disaggregate and weaken the movement as a whole, rather than pick, which version of jihadist group do we want to win this fight.
Kirsten, you want to get in on this or move on? Okay, so the next question is from China, Mike Liu. If the Taliban gains the ruling power in Afghanistan and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization may accept Iran as a formal ninth member, and it says recently, I'm not quite sure whether that means that it happened recently or it could happen soon. What does this mean? But still, it's the same point. What does this mean to the policy of the United States in the Middle East, especially in Afghanistan, as well as the USA-China relationship? Wow, anybody want to take that on first?
I'll touch on that briefly.
Okay.
One of the things the US is watching that concerns us with this is that we're looking at the SCO and the inclusion of Iran in this as a mirror to what we saw in Syria with the Astana process. We're looking at this sort of grouping of some US adversaries in these parallel efforts that undermine UN efforts to create resolution to these problems in the region. So SCO, otherwise fine, great, love to see it do more, great to see it's pro-social. But when it starts to coalesce like this, we are very concerned that it might take up Afghanistan as an issue, and this would undermine the US, undermine the UN, and create another kind of model of how these parallel processes can be potentially more effective than the internationally recognized processes. And that's a dangerous precedent to set. So the timing couldn't be worse, in effect, for Iran joining from kind of the US policy perspective.
Either of you want to take this on, or should we move forward? Okay, we're going to move forward then, and we're moving from China to Morocco. Moha Enaji asks us, the Taliban government will enhance jihadist and terrorist groups worldwide, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda. It will also lead to reinforcing the influence of Iran and Russia in the region, and will weaken the position of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. What is your take on this? Maybe you don't agree with the analysis. We'll see. Anyone want to take this on?
I'll offer a couple thoughts that hopefully help answer this question. I think it's important to recognize that the US withdrawal from Afghanistan is occurring within a context of continued American retreat from global leadership. And that's actually not what the Biden administration said that it was going to do when it came into office. We were going to see America back. We were going to see a reinforcement of US alliances and a reassertion of US leadership. I think what we're encountering is not a lack of a desire by the Biden administration to do those things, but rather the hard realities of the level of statecraft that is required to succeed with multiple simultaneous challenges around the world that really are straining the ability, I think, of the United States to be as agile and sometimes as precise as actors like Iran, Russia, or even China are able to do. We're seeing US competitors maneuver in both diplomatic and military terms faster, in part because they are more comfortable operating under conditions of instability. And I think one of the big challenges for the United States moving forward is, how do we calibrate US policy in conditions where we're not going to be able to eliminate the instability, though we desire it, right? We're not going to be able to stabilize Syria in the immediate term. And we've really struggled to craft policies, whereas the Russians stepped in with the Astana process, as was mentioned, and now we're starting to see a similar recalibration in Central Asia, recognizing the opportunities that US adversaries have in leveraging the continued chaos in Afghanistan. Because look, Afghanistan is going to continue to remain a volatile region. It's entirely possible that we'll see new conditions of civil war in Afghanistan. And I think US adversaries are ahead of the game. They're ahead of US policy in their ability to adapt and to find these targeted ways to gain leverage and to use it to advance their interests amidst that instability.
Anybody else want to get in on this?
I'll jump in on the back of what Jenny said,
sure, Kirsten.
and just kind of walk through some of what I think Russia, China, and then Saudi and the UAE are thinking. I think Russia, we're already seeing play both sides. This is kind of, they sort of love when things get chaotic, because their whole goal is just to create instability that allows them leverage. So we know that they were on the ground coordinating with the Taliban during the takeover of Kabul, and we know that they've already reached out to Massoud's folks up north. So they are unabashedly kind of anti-side picking in this sense, and this could work out very, very well for them. They could wind up looking like peacemakers. They could wind up. We'll see. I'll leave it there on Russia. We can talk more about it if you like. But on China, I think the fact that they're mercantilist in their approach to any country like this gives them a way to say, we're just in making sure we keep the place stable. We're not getting involved in the politics. We're not picking sides here. And by defining their foreign policy that way, they've avoided what the US and the West have done, which is have a value-based approach to these kinds of scenarios. So they get away with quite a bit more, but it's also a big risk, big reward proposition. So they have a lot to gain in terms of resource extraction. But if the Taliban wind up being absolute monsters, as a lot of expectations would dictate, then China's going to be intrinsically tied to that as well. So they have to kind of choose how involved they're going to get. There's also risk for their own people. They don't tend to care about kind of value of individual human lives as much in their ethos as Western nations do. But if they put folks inside, they're also going to be potential collateral damage for this the civil war potential that Robin and Jenny mentioned. And then I think in Saudi and the UAE, I don't think they're going to be weakened by this, but I think they are recalculating. it gives them even stronger justifications for things like arms weapons purchases that they want to do. They're in a stronger leveraging position with the US because they'll be needed for over the horizon counterterrorism. They can bring they can bring funding to other countries, Central Asia, India, Pakistan, that will feel the need to make their own defenses and their own border security more robust, which would give them political leverage. So I think in some strange ways, while it makes them more vulnerable on the CT front, it makes them stronger on the political front.
All right, you mentioned Pakistan, and we've got 3 questions that involve somewhat Pakistan. I had thought of going in that direction more in the next 2 sessions that follow, but the group is smarter than I am. And so we're going to Canada now. Hamid Georgiani asks, and he asks for Robin, in the context of Robin's comments, the first generation of the Taliban were called to action by Brzezinski, who asked them to go and liberate their mosques from those godless communists. Will the grandchildren of those warriors be mobilized to soften the soft belly of the PRC in northern Afghanistan? Not an easy question. I don't know how I'd answer it. How would you, Robin?
I'm not sure.
I don't think so.
I don't understand the question, I think.
I think that
is he talking about the Northern Alliance?
Yes, he's talking about I think he's talking about our using the grandchildren of those who were asked to go and liberate their mosques from the godless communists, whether we will try to use that again. In other words, we did pretty well with weakening the Russians. Can we do pretty well with, without invading, can we do pretty well with weakening the Taliban? That's how I interpret the question. Personally, I think, I don't know how the 3 of you feel, that this is just not American today. It's very unlikely. It's just not us anymore. But maybe somebody disagrees with me or agrees.
Well, there was a poll issued yesterday by the Eurasia Group Foundation that found that the majority of Americans would prefer diplomacy over engaging in another conflict. I think that reflects the wariness generally of the American public after 2 decades of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Frankly, the US intervention in the 1980s against during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan really unleashed the phenomena that we are experiencing now on a much wider scale. There are lessons, and I would only hope that the military and policymakers would begin to understand that, the causal effect, cause and effect, the consequences of one action playing out in an entirely different way that is against American interests long term. I think the Israelis learned that when they intervened in Lebanon against the PLO and unleashed Hezbollah, which is today the most effective, the biggest and best armed militia across the Middle East, with its own franchises in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. So, the idea that I think Americans don't want to go back. I just hope that American policymakers will, in their assessments of what happened in Afghanistan, look at not just our experience, but the broader confrontation we've had with jihadis and how we were de facto allies with Osama bin Laden in the 1980s when the Soviets occupied Afghanistan, and look where that got us. So, we don't seem to learn the lessons, and I fear we may not again.
Ouch. Either one of you have a comment on that before we go on to a similar, well, we're going on to similar questions. First, still now in British Columbia, from Gordon Longmuir. I am not hearing much about Pakistan's role. Is the Pakistani military still a player? Can Pakistan play any role in stabilizing the situation in Afghanistan? I know how I would answer. And then going up to a UCLA alum, Eric Selkoff, can any of you talk about how Pakistan and Turkey's support of the Taliban will affect their relationship with the US and Europe? Not quite as similar as I remembered reading it a few minutes ago, but at any rate, any one of you and the want to deal with either or both of those issues, both of which mention Pakistan. Anybody?
I'll offer a couple thoughts. Look, in my view, I think it's pretty clear that Pakistan is a huge source of the problem, and one that the United States failed to address early enough in our involvement in Afghanistan. I think that speaks for itself. I think the more interesting question from my perspective is, why did the United States have such a tough time squaring this circle, so to speak? And I would offer that I think the US policy process has a tendency to fail to resolve the friction points between different policies. In this case, US policy towards Pakistan and the strategy of the US war in Afghanistan. We were unable to resolve the tension, and we've demonstrated a similar shortcoming consistently in the Middle East, where US policy in Syria and US policy towards Iraq and towards Iran were all misaligned with each other and often at odds with the counter ISIS strategy. And the result was that the United States achieved a lot operationally on the ground and then struggled, as I mentioned earlier, to turn that into a strategic outcome. We got outmaneuvered by the Iranians on many fronts. We got outmaneuvered by the Russians. And I think I raise that because we often regard the US failure in Afghanistan as a military failure. I think that we have learned a lot about failures by the US military in Afghanistan. However, I think we need to pay greater attention to the senior decision-making failures on the civilian level, which is ultimately where the responsibility for waging a war lies. It lies with our politicians, our elected political leaders. And resolving those tensions inherent in these policies is not something that the US military can do. They have to execute the policies that they are given within the constraints that are set. And I think the United States is very painfully experiencing the consequences of, the limit of advance that can be achieved when you have these fundamental tensions inherent in a strategy that don't receive the level of attention, including diplomatic attention, that they need. So I'll stop there.
Interesting argument. Anybody else want to come in on this?
Yeah,
Looks like Robin does.
I'll weigh in on Pakistan. The reality is that the Pakistanis were the biggest obstacle in American strategy. They offered sanctuary, funding, training, access to the leadership of Al Qaeda and the Taliban. And, when we wanted the Pakistanis to pressure the Taliban or try to restrain or contain the Taliban, it did virtually nothing. And I think going forward, that's an issue too. Pakistan has been a kind of ally, or has worked with the United States. There are diplomatic channels, and there's a lot of discussion. But the idea that Pakistan will in any way help us, I think, is an illusion. They never did, and I don't think they're likely to. When it comes to Turkey, this is a kind of more dynamic issue. The United States has turned to Turkey as a NATO ally and said, can you help secure the airport in Kabul long-term, but also to facilitate the evacuation of remaining Americans and SIV immigrants. So the Turks, like the Qataris, are players in trying to navigate this post-US role in Afghanistan, and the Turks have leverage over us, unfortunately, on this. The Turks haven't always been so cooperative lately either, and they've kind of gone off on their own and done their own things. And President Erdogan has become increasingly kind of autocratic at home as well. So that makes it harder for us to press any kind of agenda elsewhere in the region, on Syria, for example, or on human rights when it comes to Turkey's internal policies. But both countries, both Pakistan and Turkey, will have a lot to do with what happens next and what we're able to facilitate in the way of helping the people we want to leave. And that's the tragedy ultimately, that we're trying to use our diplomatic leverage to help the very people who developed Afghanistan, who gave it dimension and depth politically, socially, and economically, to get them out. And what does that leave behind for this poor country?
Anybody else?
I'll agree with all of that. And I would only just add that, I can't wait to hear other folks talk about the Pakistan question, because I think how we handle them is going to be fascinating. We can't forget that the reason Pakistan made a lot of these decisions, and this is not in any way excusing their actions, because it frankly hasn't borne out for them, but was because they perceived groups like the Taliban or Al Qaeda as deterrents against what they thought was Indian aggression. So as long as we don't help solve for that problem, or the international community doesn't help solve for that problem, then we're probably going to face this again and again. And we find that there used to be factions within the Pakistani government about those who supported this kind of support that was kind of done covertly through the ISI, and those who didn't. But now, for instance, we saw Imran Khan say publicly that Afghanistan has thrown off the shackles of slavery when the Taliban took over. So we can clearly say, all right, there's one mind in Pakistani decision-making about this, and it's not on our side. So we are going to have to maybe show some tough love. But if we recall in the 80s, when we tried to punish Pakistan for kind of not siding with us and leaning more, toward Russia at the time, we cut off all of their IMET, for instance. We didn't bring any of their officers here for training. And what we did was create a generation of folks who had no U.S. training and no affinity for America. And what that meant was a leadership core now that is not pro-U.S. They haven't studied here. They haven't developed friendships here. We've sent officers to their training academy, and they've started sending them back, but we're still reaping the results of what we did in the 80s, of that decision in the 80s that I think made sense when we made that decision then, but now we have that lesson learned. If we push them away, doesn't mean that they actually make decisions that are against our interests, in coming generations. So how should we handle this? How do we bring their decision makers kind of back on side? Is it by pointing out the fact that keeping these groups under their umbrella has not been good for them, has not yielded the objectives they were hoping it would yield? No, they haven't been invaded by India. That probably wasn't going to happen anyway. So what is it that our South Asia experts need to be doing in terms of engaging with Pakistan to kind of switch the way that they are strategizing on this?
I would add just a quick two-finger on that excellent point, if I could. I think
Sure.
this is
Go
an
right
obvious
ahead.
note, but worth adding, which is that part of the Salafi jihadi movement has also turned on Pakistan. And Pakistan has its own terrorism problem, a radicalization problem also that points towards a dangerous future for the Pakistani government. And I think how the United States interacts with that aspect of its relationship with Pakistan, especially as ISIS regenerates inside of Afghanistan and likely extends further into Pakistan, we could see some very difficult proposals put to the United States for what kind of pressure is the United States going to support against jihadist groups. Is it enough that Pakistan is under threat for us to support them? Or are we going to need certain concessions from Pakistan in order to, be a recipient of US aid? I don't know what timeline that threat will mature on. That's one of the biggest questions, I think, moving forward. But the intersection of these challenges is really going to pose a very difficult set of decisions, probably for this American president, but certainly for his successor as well.
Okay, we're going into a period of 3 questions, each from someone in the Middle East. Very excited that we're having so many different countries represented here. And there are questions for some of you. The first goes to Robin from Bassem Shab of Lebanon. Do you see Afghanistan becoming a distraction for Iran, affecting its efforts in the Levant?
Simple answer, no. I think this, the longstanding relationship and interest by Iran in the Levant is not going to change at all. Afghanistan will be a more of a priority, or rise on. It's always been on Iran's front burner. The current head of the Quds Force, the man who succeeded General Soleimani, is a specialist in Afghanistan and has many contacts there. I think they will be scrambling to kind of figure out what happens next. And the Iranians, as always, play all sides of any issue. They have longstanding contacts with all the different ethnic groups and the different religious sects. But Iran's interest in the Levant is deep and profound and dates back 500 years to the moment that Lebanon's Shiites helped convert the Sunni Persian Empire into a Shiite state as a way of creating an alternative identity to the expanding Ottoman Empire. And that's an existential relationship that is not likely to change next year or even the next century.
So they stick around Levant and they don't move towards Afghanistan, despite what some people feel is an opportunity.
I'm not sure that it's an issue of moving toward anything. Iran will always play. It's on its border. This is, I think it's 900 miles long.
People forget that. Yeah.
They have issues of narcotics trafficking and really chronic. There are huge environmental issues and water issues, health issues. So there are a lot of common interests. There has been a lot of contact. Remember, the Iranians, after the Doha talks, kind of went into open-ended stalemate. The Iranians hosted the Taliban and the Afghan government for negotiations this spring and this summer held meetings. So they will be involved, but Afghanistan is not in that sense a distraction. They've always been involved. They'll continue to be involved. Their game strategy may change, but Iran's priorities are pretty consistent.
Got it. Anybody else before we move on to a question from you? Yes. Kirsten?
Yeah, I simply would add, fully agree, of course, with Robin, that I think it's also important to note that the Iranians are not under that much pressure in the Levant. And that could change with a more proactive, U.S. approach to constraining Iranian regional expansion. But so far, the Iranians are able to do both, in part because they don't face the kind of disruptive pressure that would really erode their ability to, continue to coordinate across both theaters. I don't think we're likely to see that pressure emerge anytime soon. And while the impact of sanctions, does hurt, it certainly, we have seen over the last few years, does not preclude the Iranians from performing this kind of coordination across theaters.
Kirsten, did you want to get in on this?
Just going to agree with everything we've heard. But that's it. And I would only add that I think that Iran is seeing in Afghanistan kind of a delicious opportunity. It's just too juicy to pass up. It's another opportunity potentially to fund or support any kind of splinter group that will create problems for your adversaries, create problems for the U.S., create fear in the Gulf. Cheaply. And it's a model that they excel at. It's a model that they love to implement. So I think we'll watch them become more involved simply because they just can't resist an opportunity like this. But I agree with everything Robin and Jenny said about them being consistent about their strength in position in the Levant right now. So this won't be a distraction. They have the bandwidth, maybe not the funding, but if this comes cheaply again, then it won't really be an issue for them.
Okay, we're moving over to Dubai. And I hope I get the name of Thafar Maita correct. But this is a question for Jennifer. How will the Taliban model inspire the Middle Eastern organization and African movements?
Great question. I think it's important to note that it already has. So one of the strongest Salafist jihadist groups inside of Syria is the former Al-Qaeda affiliate, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which has long been holding the Taliban as the model for the kind of governance that they intend to deliver, and actually have already started delivering in northwest Syria. The fact that that doesn't get more attention is in part a product of how complicated the Syrian civil war is and the exhaustion generally in the West towards that conflict, but also because of the extent to which the Turks have thrown their arms around this jihadist group in Idlib and decided to work with it as a way of maintaining pressure on the Assad regime and the Russians. What I think we need to watch for is how the Taliban performs in governance. We've already discussed issues with the Taliban consolidating physical control and security. I do think there are more abuses by the Taliban that are actual intentional Taliban abuses than are getting covered very widely in the West. I think we've already seen that kind of retributive violence. But it's not a given, actually, that the Taliban is able to implement the model of governance that they desire. So I think we need to watch how the theory of success evolves now that the Taliban have this new opportunity to deliver what they've long been promising they would reimpose in Afghanistan, but under the pressures of the modern age, which includes, of course, technology and increased connectivity of populations that does in some cases make it more difficult to stifle dissent and impose law. And we'll have to see both how the Taliban does and how the other elements of the jihadist movement, including Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria, regard the Taliban. Do they continue to regard it as a success and as a model to follow? Or, do they start to see weaknesses that then causes them to adapt?
Well, let me ask this question myself. What if the Taliban themselves get stuck with other groups that want to take over their position, that they may be letting in, they may be getting in? What happens then? I've wondered about this. The Taliban 25 years ago didn't seem to have the competition of what we would call bad guys, but problems that they now have inside Afghanistan. True, false? Anything happen? Anybody want to take me on?
Well,
I would welcome, yeah, go ahead, Robin.
no, I was just going to say that there is ISIS, but it is comparatively small. We're talking about 60 to 70,000 Taliban fighters, compare with the estimates range from 1, maybe maximum 2,000 ISIS fighters. It may have been, we're all wondering when the prisoners were released as part of the Doha agreement, 5,000 of them, how many of them opted to join ISIS or rejoin ISIS. So there's a lot of uncertainty about the numbers, but we're talking about, a huge difference in the capability. I think the ISIS also is engaged in the kind of pot shots of an insurgency in limited areas. It doesn't hold any territory the way that the Taliban did. And so I think the idea that anything imminent, now, could there be instability that undermines the Taliban and leads people to defect because the Taliban is inept or doesn't deliver? Sure, that's a real possibility down the road. As we've seen, jihadism evolves. Just remember that. It keeps evolving. And groups go through periods where one is on high, like ISIS was during the 5 years of the caliphate in Iraq and Syria. And Al-Qaeda is now back because the Taliban regained control of Afghanistan. So there's a lot of back and forth, but I don't think there's any, existential threat to the Taliban in the immediate future.
I would add that I think one theme that's worth watching in the long-term perspective that Robin just framed is the extent to which the Taliban attempts to integrate into the international system and whether that does trigger backlash from other elements within the jihadist movement. I think ISIS is going to prioritize attempting to undermine the Taliban's legitimacy on that ground, on the closeness of the Taliban's relationship to Pakistan in the first instance, and then secondly, framing the Taliban potentially as a sellout or having abandoned the ideology for being willing to participate in structures such as the UN, that for ISIS are a complete anathema to the ideology.
And there's just one reality. I agree with Jennifer completely, but the thing that's really striking is there was a story, I think, in the last 48 hours that all the dollars have disappeared at banks in Afghanistan. And the government is going to be in enormous trouble in trying to, whether it's import medicines or kind of the basic necessities of life. They're willing to live sparsely, but the public is going to want a lot of basic necessities. And if you don't have the foreign exchange, foreign currency to do that, suddenly the Taliban really needs the outside world and may end up engaging in the kind of compromises that do indeed draw people to ISIS and other gangs turned militias.
Okay, well, let's move on to Israel. From Udi Eventhal, what are the implications to the broader Middle East of the strengthened image that the U.S. is phasing out from the region? How is this going to influence Iran's quest for hegemony in the region and on its nuclear policy? Anybody want to take that on?
That's easy.
Pardon?
Look, the United States is going to continue to protect Israel. It's continue to be its closest ally. That's not going to change. Do questions about America's credibility and commitment and longevity in any conflict, in any crisis, raise questions? I think it does empower Iran. I think look at what happened in 2001 to 2003 as the US went into Afghanistan and Iraq, and how the Iranians ended up offering the so-called grand bargain. And the subsequent series of events led them to engage under pressure and fear of them being next with the United States, the international community, on the nuclear deal. I think given not just the American withdrawal from Afghanistan, but the election of a hardline regime in Iran changes an awful lot about what happens next. I met twice with the Iranian foreign minister just last week at the United Nations, and I can tell you they're going to play hardball, and I think it's going to be very tough. So all of these factors play in to empowering Iran.
Well, doesn't it also imply a closer relationship on this issue between the United States and Israel, in the sense that the disagreements will not be as great if the options for the United States are diminished?
I don't know about I think that's possible, but I think that there is some water between the two visions, and Israel has made it clear to the US administration, we have our own red lines and we will act unilaterally if we have to. They haven't minced any words about that. So, I think they continue to try to send the message to this administration that, if you don't get us where you're promising to take us, we may be forced to act, and don't be surprised when we are. The rumors we all heard here about some sort of agreement between the two defense ministers about, a no surprises promise, were just rumors. That didn't actually happen. And Israel is insistent that they retain the right to act if they feel as if they need to, if the US cannot get us to a deal that they think would constrain Iran in a meaningful way that would not pose an immediate threat or even a midterm threat to Israel. So, hi, Udi, by the way, just saying hello. I think to Robin's point that it's not only the US withdrawal that is giving Iran this sort of feeling they can be a greater hegemon. It's also their own actions. The problem, as I see it, is that Iran thinks that this withdrawal puts the US in a weakened position where we're desperate for a foreign policy win. And the way I'm reading the US administration is the opposite, is that it really can't afford to look weak domestically. So it's less likely to offer concessions in talks in Vienna or anywhere else, so that we are likely to be at a greater standoff than we even have been on nuclear conversations, which means Israel is putting more pressure on the US, which means there could be more division between those two policies. I think the reason that's dangerous for the US is because the position of being at talks but not actually having to take action is Iran's sweet spot. They can reap the goodwill of the international community, but they can continue on with their, kind of regional misbehaviors. So it's a place that they're comfortable, and it's a place that we are not comfortable.
Interesting. Anyone else? Well, we're going to move back to UCLA and the United States. And let me say that we do have questions coming, but we don't have as many as would fill up our program. I can always do that. But if any of you want to ask any questions, this is a moment. I know a lot of people think at this point, there are probably 25 people ahead of me. It's not worth it. Well, it is worth it. You probably can get on if you ask a question now. But meanwhile, we have one from UCLA student in the Luskan operation here, Ramon Hossein, if I've got his pronunciation correct. And he asks, back to Pakistan, how should the U.S. engage Pakistan in the future, considering their 20-year double game and strategic victory over India with the Taliban takeover? We've touched on this, but I guess there are more to come. As Ramon thinks, what are your thoughts on Pakistan overall? We've had some of this, and even the next question is on Pakistan. Everybody's interested in Pakistan today, to my astonishment. But do you all have any comments on this? And I'll quickly be asking another question in a minute or two also about Pakistan, but in a different direction. Anybody want to take this on? Well, let me include, I know we've been talking about Pakistan a lot. Let me include our next question from Jonathan Gardner, also in the United States, which is related to this, and we'll take both questions at once. Can you comment on Pakistan with Taliban 2.0 next door? How threatened is the government? What, I assume the government is the Pakistani government. What risks do we need to consider with regards to Pakistan's nukes? Will Pakistan's relationship with the Taliban threaten India? I actually was thinking of asking that of all of you. So we've got a big package of Pakistan, Pakistan's future, Pakistan's presence, Pakistan and Taliban. Anybody have anything to ask about that one?
Yes, the Pakistani relationship with the Taliban does threaten India, but it always has. It's not new. And if I'm Pakistan, the reason I'm not happy about this is because now there's renewed sympathy and concern about India's safety. So India is attracting all kinds of new partners, all kinds of new interests. And if we watch the narrative coming out of India about this, their largest concern is making sure that the international community holds Pakistan accountable for the Taliban takeover in Kabul. Whether or not that's accurate, that's really India's main narrative on this. And I think India is probably in a good position. They shouldn't be worried about their security as a result, but without even trying, they're going to attract all kinds of sympathy and what that can mean in terms of new approvals from Congress for acquisition deals, what that can mean in terms of foreign assistance funding, foreign military sales approvals. I mean, I think India is in a kind of a good position. So Pakistan may think, great, the folks that we backed are now in the seat of power in Afghanistan, but it's actually driven some support to their strategic adversary. So Pakistan will need to consider that. And I think we covered quite a bit before on the US relationship with Pakistan and a lot of what we will have to consider and what other parts of the region might be considering with regard to Pakistan. So I'll leave it to others if Robin or Jenny want to jump in.
Anybody? All right, we have several questions coming, so we'll move on. Howard Rosoff, a UCLA alum. Why is America unable to learn the lessons of Vietnam and Iraq and learn that we cannot impose our culture or form of government on other countries? Then why we failed in Afghanistan as in the other places, something you often hear at the dinner table. Anybody want to take this on? Robin looks like she does.
I'd be happy to. And I think one of the things that was so interesting coming out of the testimony over 2 days by Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, Joint Chiefs of Staff General Milley, and General McKenzie, the head of Central Command, was the kind of confessional about all the things that the United States misread, the real fundamental misunderstanding of Afghanistan, whether it was the issue of how corrupt the system, not just the leadership, but the system had become, how the rank and file in the military felt little loyalty to the government of Ashraf Ghani, that, as General Milley said, we can measure the number of tanks or planes or where troops are, but there's no machine that can measure the human heart. And so I think that there is a reckoning that's going on now, and I think it will probably be the subject of debate for not just weeks and months, but years to come as the US looks back at this moment. There is a pattern here when you look at Vietnam and the US withdrawal and the pictures, that played next to each other of the evacuation from Saigon and the evacuation from Kabul, whether it's the withdrawal of the US Marine peacekeepers in Beirut, where I lived in the early 1980s, whether it's the withdrawal from Iraq and now Afghanistan. There's a real question about the US commitment. We were so able during World War II, which led us to become a superpower in fighting, whether it was the sophisticated German Nazi machine or the Japanese Empire. And today we seem unable to take on these kind of insurgencies, these ragtag these ragtag militias around the world. They seem to have the last word. And I think one of the questions, and I wrote about this amid much controversy, is does this mark kind of the end of the great American era, 80 years of being a superpower? We know that we are somewhat diminished in this competition with China, less so Russia, but that there are a lot of challenges. Is the West in general, remembering that NATO was also alongside American troops in Afghanistan, is the West generally more fractured, whether it's the wobbly leadership in Europe or Brexit as the European Union kind of fractures? Are we not as able in the West to take on these great challenges, whether it's from jihadis or our rival powers? I think there are a lot of questions that have yet to be answered, but there is a pattern evolving that I think we all should heed and not just assume, well, when we want to fight a war, we can win. The one thing we've learned is we're not winning wars. And as General Milley said, this was a strategic failure. The war was lost. And I think that's some pretty blunt talk from the men who for years had argued that we were winning.
Wow. Well, when you have some of the very best people in the country with you, sometimes they have to come a little late, have to leave a little early. And I know that Robin has to run off to yet another meeting. So is there anything, that was quite a powerful ending, but if you have anything else to say for our audience, this is the moment, and then we'll move on to this question for our other two speakers.
The only last thing I'd say is we are out of Afghanistan. Our war has ended, but as the general said yesterday, the war is not over. We need to still pay attention. And all of these issues, all the things that got us into Afghanistan are going to continue to be just as important in determining our national security in the future as they have been for the last 20 years. And with that, I thank you, Steve. It's always fun to be with you. Thank you, Kirsten and Jennifer. Love listening to you.
Thank you very much, Robin. And let me, both of you have your hands up. So let me say, Kirsten and then Jennifer, we have a question coming for Kirsten. So I'll give her a moment's rest after you speak and Jennifer answers, and then you'll be next, Kirsten. So Kirsten, what do you think of what Robin said, and what's your answer to the question?
I agree with Robin, as I often do. I would say, just to really simplify it, one of the other things I think is happening is that is simply a timeline issue. By the time Iraq rolled around after Vietnam, a lot of our decision makers had retired out, and we'd forgotten a lot of the lessons. And then Afghanistan and Iraq were so closely timed that we tried to apply the lessons too closely and without having learned the outcomes of those lessons. We didn't have the lessons yet. We just tried to apply what we thought we were learning along the way. So we're building two planes, flying them at the same time, hoping that since a part didn't fall off of one, it wouldn't fall off of another, even though eventually it fell off of both, that kind of thing. I think what worries me is that we're about to unlearn another lesson. So we have a massive reassessment of our military posture going on, and we have a reassessment of our use of military force happening at the same time. So Joint Special Operations Command in the US, for instance, is looking at how to redeploy our special operations forces for a non-door kicker war, for a non-kinetic war. If we're turning to the South China Sea, focus more on cyber, focus more on hypersonics. And what do we do with this trained, expensive, because it takes years and millions to turn them into the precision warfighters that they are. How do we take these special operators and retool them for great power competition? Okay, we probably need to do some of that. But if we're going to do over the horizon CT, we still need people to fight the kind of war that Robin was just talking about, that we're learning is the preferred methodology of a lot of our non-state adversaries. So if we completely retool Joint Special Operations Command as one example, then we'll be left without tools when this same kind of guerrilla warfare and every iteration of it comes back to bite us again. So my hope is that we don't unlearn that lesson and think we need to entirely turn the ship in a way that leaves us unprepared for a fourth or fifth iteration of the same kind of warfare.
Well, do you have any comments, Jennifer?
Well, unsurprisingly, I fully agree with Robin and Kirsten. So what I would offer is just one more angle on this, which I think takes us further into what kinds of requirements the United States is likely to face in coming years. Because I think Kirsten is absolutely right. We need to be able to walk and chew gum. We need to be able to leverage our capabilities against great powers while recognizing that we face a greater terrorism threat from Salafi jihadi groups now than we did 20 years ago, in terms of the scope and scale and resources and resonance of that movement. So we're going to need to continue to have door kickers who are able to go in and conduct, high value raids and targeting against senior members and, key external operations nodes, et cetera. But I would offer that I think there's also something else emerging that we haven't yet fully thought through, which is the nexus points where these two types of threats overlap. And I think we could face requirements like we have avoided dealing with actually in Syria, where we have a local terrorism problem, in this case, ISIS in eastern Syria, on top of which is layered a regional competition with Iran. Even if we don't think we're competing with Iran, Iran is certainly competing with us to shape the long-term trajectory of the region, and a competition with Russia that the United States has either regarded as likely to